really wish they could have done more there. There was so much more than her just being able to produce a male heir. And I feel like for a feminist show, they should have talked about that. I mean, for one, Jane was really good friends with her stepdaughter, Mary, and just that compassion alone with how messy those marriages and that whole thing was, the fact that she was friends with her, that she was compassionate toward her, that she tried to reinstate her in the line of succession, that speaks volumes about who Jane was. And yet, they just reduce her song to the fact that historians think of her as a baby factory, and that's why she was Henry's favorite, because she was able to have a boy. I don't know why they omitted everything that made Jane Jane. And the weirdest choice of all.
So, no. First thing I want to say is I realized that the person who was making that video didn't do like a real like in-depth dive into it, and just from like just looking at it, yes, Jane looks really good and Anne Boleyn, my main homie, looks really bad. But if you actually really deep dive into it the way I have my whole entire fucking life, they actually come out looking very different than the way she was talking about them. But the first thing I want to say about it is, yes, Anne is my favorite. That doesn't mean I think that she did no wrong. She was an amazing person. Like, I know she had her faults. I know she did bad things. That also saying, I don't want to pin any of these women against each other, any of the wives against another wife, because everybody else already does that. History will always do that. Historians will always do that. I'm not wanting to do that. But my thing is, yes, Anne Boleyn did unseat Catherine of Aragon, but it was not Anne's fault. It wasn't. Because she was controlled by Henry VIII. Well, yes, he was the king. She couldn't tell him no. She had already told him no, like, no, I'm not going to be your mistress. Once he was like, okay, well, you're going to be my wife. She can't tell him no. She can't run. She can't go anywhere. There's nobody above him. There's nobody to help her get out from under him. So what was she supposed to do? She went along with it. I mean, if it hadn't been her, it would have been somebody else. Catherine was going out. Like, that was just it. Henry was done with her. And that was it. Anne wasn't the one that made him disown Mary. She, as far as I know, she didn't fight for him not to do that, but she didn't tell him to do that. He was the king. She couldn't tell him to do anything. It was all within his control, within his power, his decision. He chose to do that. Just like when he was displeased with Anne, he chose to have her executed on crimes that he knew she didn't commit. There was no proof. All the proof they had could be easily dispelled just by looking at it. But he chose to believe it. He chose to let them try her, and he chose to sign her death warrant. That was his decision. And he chose, while Anne was still alive, while they were still married, to be courting Jane Seymour. He made that choice. She also, Jane Seymour, made the choice to do the same thing Anne did, was to deny him, say, no, I'm not going to be your mistress. They did the exact same thing, okay? But the difference is, and the thing that I object to in her video, was she brings up, oh, but Jane was so compassionate to Mary. She was. But she didn't give a shit about Elizabeth, Anne's daughter. You know, Queen Elizabeth I. Didn't give a shit about her. Because Jane had served Catherine of Aragon as Lady of Waiting. Jane was Catholic. She believed that Anne was a usurper and just a mistress, and she believed that Anne, maybe possibly poisoned Catherine, was the reason that Mary was in all this dire distress. She believed, Jane believed, that Anne was a horrible person. Her and her family set out to displace Anne. That's what they wanted. They didn't want to advocate for Elizabeth because they wanted Mary to be the heir again, because they were Catholic and they supported Catherine and they supported Rome. That's what they wanted, because they knew that if Mary became queen, she would move the country back to Catholicism, which she did. That's what they wanted. And it was all great. Like, I'm glad Jane was nice to Mary. She needed it after years of neglect and being treated like a servant. Like, she needed somebody to come in and help her and make her life better. I'm not saying that Jane shouldn't have done that. But if you're going to say she's such a good person, she showed such compassion for Mary, you have to also bring up that she didn't really show that much for Elizabeth. The person that did the most for Elizabeth was Catherine Parr. His last wife did the most for both of his daughters. Anne of Cleves did a lot for both daughters. Jane did a little bit for Elizabeth, having her brought to court for Christmas and like trying to get Henry to talk to her again. But her main focus was Mary. Mary was the one that she cared about. And that's not being a good stepmother. That's not being the most compassionate person. That's not having a good character. That's having a clear idea of what you want and going for it, no matter who else is in the way. She wanted to take the country back to Rome. That's what, if she had lived, she would have raised her son to believe. But because she died, her son was raised in the Protestant faith, and then he, ironically, was the one that when he became king to move the country more towards Protestantism than ever before. And she was Henry's favorite because she had a son. That's literally the reason that she was Henry's favorite. The only reason. Because that's all he wanted. All he wanted in his whole life was to have a son. If she had lived longer and not had that son, she would have been displaced just as easily as Catherine and Anne were. Anne as the next Anne of Cleves would be. Anne as Catherine Howard would be. She would have been one of them if she had lived longer and not had a son. If she had lived after having her son, she would not have had any additional power. She wouldn't have been able to bring the church to Catholicism like she thought she would be able to because she had a son. Because Henry was Henry. He was going to do what he wanted. Once she had a son, he'd be like, where's my second son? Where's my heir to spare? Where's my second one? Don't give me a daughter. Where's my second son? He would not have been happy. He would not have stayed in love with her if she lived, even if she had given him a son. That's just who he was. And we should all remember to place the blame squarely on him and to stop saying that any of these women had any choice in anything that happened to them. Because none of them did. They were all under control of the men of their age because women in that time had no control over anything. They had no money, no titles, no lands. They couldn't do anything for themselves. They had to have a man do it for them. That's just the way it was. And I like Jane fine. I think she deliberately set out to bring Anne down. But Anne, she didn't originally intend to bring Catherine down. But once Anne figured out that the only way she was going to get out of this was that she couldn't get out of it, she had to do something. She set out to displace Catherine because she knew that was the only way that any of this was going to benefit her and not just her family. I mean, that's what happened with Catherine Howard. I'm just annoyed. And I'm very, very passionate about my girl. My girl. And her girl. And then there's Mary Stuart. But yeah. So I don't... And again, I don't blame the user who made that video because she probably didn't do a deep dive of her history. Everybody has their different opinions. Everybody is always going to think, you know, Anne was this catty bitch who stole some woman's husband, but like, it wasn't her fault. And Jane was not being compassionate for the sake of compassion. She was doing it because she had a goal in mind. She had ambition. She wanted to bring the church back to Catholicism. Okay. She wasn't being nice to Mary just because. Okay? Okay. And I'll see you next time then.